I'm a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire, and I'll be talking about the community, the DPDK Community Lab. This presentation will be kind of similar to the presentation I've done I did in Dublin, if any of you were there. And for people that are familiar with the DPDK Community Lab, the original name started with the DPDK Performance Lab, and then the DPDK Open Lab, and now it's the DPDK Community Lab. So hopefully that's the last name change. So I'll be talking about what the Community Lab is about and what we will be doing in the future. I'll be talking about the performance, some of the performance that we've kind of collected over time, because we essentially do performance testing, like collecting relative performance results between member companies. And for more context, I work at the University of New Hampshire InterOperability Lab, and the lab is hosting this DPDK testing service. So testing DPDK is important because a lot of companies are using DPDK. It's getting more and more widespread, a lot more usage. So it's important to test the performance and make sure that patches being submitted to DPDK are performant. If there's a noticeable drop with the performance lab, maintainers can see that drop, or if there's a boost in performance, it might be like a noteworthy change to mention to the groups. And possibly in the future, we might look into maybe doing more unit testing, so that can help with the stability of DPDK, and in general helps with the maintainability of DPDK. So before the DPDK Community Lab, if you use, so when you submit patches to DPDK, they'll show up on Patchwork. There is a checks section underneath each patch that shows, depending on what the context is, how your patch is doing. So before the Community Lab, there was just essentially code style checks, and it just checks to see if it was compiled all right. So there's no performance testing, no unit test, no public testing that showed up. And what's now being sent to Patchwork is our Community Lab results. So currently, we publicly send results we have an Intel platform and a Mellanox platform. And so when patches are submitted, we run through testing, and then we send our results to the mailing list, and that gets put onto Patchwork. And then you can see when you submit a patch what the performance was like. This only shows, if you sent a series of patches, it will only show up on the first patch. But we might change that in the future, because it's a little bit confusing when it's the first patch that has it and maybe not the last patch, because we don't test each individual patch in the series. It's the whole series together that we test. So another reason for doing the testing at the lab is we kind of provide neutral testing. So the IOL, we have a lot of member companies that do testing with us, do conformance testing or interoperability testing between companies, and we make sure everything is neutral and all these checks are under control. So having the lab hosted at the IOL helps with that neutrality between specifically performance metrics, because we don't want this is not meant for benchmarks. It's meant for just knowing if a patch is performant. So we only save the delta results and publish the delta results for these patches. So this diagram taken from the DPDK website shows how it works. Essentially, the community sends patches to the mailing list, and our system, our CI, will pull Patchwork using their REST API, and then we apply the patch onto a branch, and then that has a baseline that we have saved locally on each vendor system. And then we run the performance test. Specifically, it's using the DPDK test suite of the single core performance test. And then once all the results are in, then we submit a email to the Patchwork mailing list, and then it gets posted to Patchwork. At the same time, it gets submitted to our database, and you can see we have an overview page of showing all the results, including some recently added graphs of the performance results between master. So as mentioned before, the current companies is like Intel and Mellanox, and we have NXP currently in the process. And as mentioned before, the lab is hosted at the IOL. And this is how the dashboard looks like right now. Essentially, it shows an overview of the patches submitted, and it kind of shows like each box is each device that it's been tested. Since it takes, depending on the device, it can take between 10 or 30 minutes to run each performance test, so it's nice to show a progress. And then each individual patch has a detailed view that shows the relative performance numbers, the test case, configuration information, like the hardware that it's on, the platform and OS. And then for members that log in that have provided the hardware, they can get artifacts that their test case produced, or they can also rerun tests in case of kind of like outliers, because we don't really run an average of tests because that would take too long. Our utilization of our CI is already around 60% based on the number of patches submitted and based on like how long the hardware, the slowest test takes. So we don't really run like multiple tests because we don't really have that extra utilization. And again, like the CI is meant to only save the relative performance results. Yeah. And for members, they can also, there's a REST API for members that they can use. So if they want to get their own data and maybe run their own analytics or whatever, they can go log into their VPN and see the REST API. Maybe it's in the future, we could look into maybe making it public, but right now it's just available to members that have provided hardware to the lab for testing. So this is a graph of just the raw performance deltas over time. It shows, I think it's about the past 2 or 3 months of data between two devices, and it is in millions. The graph shows in millions packets per second. I tried to show a trend, but I'm not really a data scientist, so I tried to do like a cumulative like adding of all the relative numbers, but that didn't end up being representative of a true trend of the data. So I only have just the points of each result. Essentially, once the test is ran, that sets the new baseline. And then the next result would set the next baseline, and so on and so forth. And I mean, that's kind of maybe a discussion point for you guys, if you guys have a suggestion of how to maybe show a trend of performance over time, because this is of the master branch. So every day we make a new baseline of master and show a delta and record a delta. And it'd be nice to be able to see if like the performance in general of DPDK is going up or going down. And then it would be useful to see, and maybe then we can track down which patches maybe cause that performance change, and then update the code if necessary. So in the future, we'd like to maybe run more performance tests. So as mentioned, we only run the single core performance test from the DPDK test suite, and maybe run more would be useful. And then maybe running unit testing for the DPDK project. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on the machines that we're given. We could run it on our own systems, unless there's maybe something more specific depending on like the drivers and such. And then running tests on release versions. So right now we're only running tests against master, and we're showing like those graphs and statistics of the master branch. It'd be nice to show like release versions, like the latest release, like the comparison between 1808 and 1811. It would be an interesting metric, and we're working on that right now. And then also showing adding that relative result to each individual test as well. And then we also want more hardware vendors involved. If your company is a member of DPDK, you can join the lab and submit hardware and have continuous testing of your hardware at the lab. And there's a possibility that you're already also a member with the IOL, because we have a lot of companies that do testing with us for a variety of other standards. And integration with other projects. So for example, OVS, we could run continuous integration testing with them, and there'll be also a presentation that Aaron from Red Hat's going to give on their CI setup at the OVS conference. And maybe possibly continuous or distributed CI, so where maybe other labs around the country or around the world, they can run their own testing and maybe submit to Patchwork, their own maybe internal hardware, and do testing with DPDK. So that's basically it. The next slide, I can't continue, but it just shows links and how to contact us. Okay. I guess I don't have it on this slide. Never mind. But yeah, okay, if you want to talk, you can email the dpdklab@iol.edu, or you can email ci@dpdk.org, I believe is the contact. And then we're going to do questions with the community Q&A panel.